I love to read. I have since I was a little girl, but I've never read the books written by today's historical topic. I fully admit the most influential reference I've had to her is the 1966 movie Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which really had nothing to do with her. But learning about her has been very interesting, and I hope you decide that too. Welcome to the Pride Chronicles, where we discuss important historical events from the LGBTQIA plus community. I'm your host, Gina, and I'm so excited you're here. So let's learn more about Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf was born Adeline Virginia Stephen on the 25th of January, 1882 in London to Julia and Sir Leslie Stephen. Her father was a writer, historian, essayist, biographer, and mountaineer, while her mother was a noted philanthropist. Originally named after her aunt Adeline, Woolf did not use her first name due to her aunt's recent death. Virginia was one of 8 children, with 4 half siblings and 3 that were born of her mother and father, 3 others, including her. Virginia showed an early affinity for writing, and by the age of 5, she was already writing letters to people, and she was fascinated with books, and that helped form a bond with her father. From the age of 10, she began an illustrated family newspaper called the Hyde Park Gate News, chronicling the life and events within the Stephen family, and it was modeled on the popular magazine of that time, Tidbits. Virginia would run the Hyde Park Gate News until 1895. In the spring of 1882, Leslie rented a large white house in St. Ives, and they called it Talent House. The family spent 3 months each summer there for the first 13 years of Virginia's life. And despite the fact it had not a lot of amenities, the house's main attraction was a view of the Porthminster Bay, and it also overlooked a beautiful lighthouse. The happy summers spent at the Talon House would later influence Woolf's novels Jacob's Room, To the Lighthouse, and The Waves. The family did not return after 1894. First, because a hotel was built that blocked the view of the sea, and unfortunately, her mother, Julia, died in May 1895. Her mother's death started what Virginia later identified as her first breakdown. For months afterwards, she was nervous and agitated, and she wrote very little for the subsequent 2 years. Virginia's oldest half-sister, Stella, stepped in after their mother's death to help her stepfather and siblings. While Stella married in 1897, she continued to care for the Stephens until her sudden death later that year. Virginia's half-brother George took over the care and leading of the family and was anxious to introduce his sisters Vanessa and Virginia to society. They both thought that experience was horrible. Years later, Virginia said, society in those days was a very competent, perfectly complacent, ruthless machine. A girl had no chance against its fangs. No other desires, say to paint or to write, could be taken seriously. In February 1904, Leslie Stephen died, which caused Virginia to suffer another period of mental instability, lasting from April to September. During this time, she experienced a severe psychological crisis, which led to at least one suicide attempt. Virginia later described the period between 1897 and 1904 as the 7 unhappy years. Virginia moved or traveled often in the coming years with family and friends to stay in quiet locations to help with her health. These trips were intended to prevent her from suffering exhaustion due to the extended periods in London. The question arose of her needing a quiet country retreat close to London to support her still fragile mental health. Now, Leonard Woolf was a politically active left-wing writer, and he was one of her brother Toby's friends at Trinity College, Cambridge, and had encountered Vanessa and Virginia in Toby's rooms while visiting between the years 1889 and 1904. After that, he traveled for work, but the image of Virginia's beauty in his mind always brought him back to London. In 1911, he and Virginia attended social engagements together, and he moved into Brunswick Square as a tenant in December of that year. Leonard proposed to Virginia in January 1912. Initially, she expressed reluctance. Emma Woolf, a relative of the family's, reported that hesitating throughout the spring of 1912 over Leonard's proposal, Virginia had struggled to reconcile being half in love with him, with a sort of revulsion over the sexual side of it. Writing to him a few weeks before they became engaged, she explained what was holding her back. As I told you brutally the other day, I feel no attraction in you. There are moments when you kissed me the other day, was one, when I feel no more than a rock. Some suggest this was due to the sexual abuse she received from her half-brothers in her youth. Despite this, Virginia finally declared her love for Leonard in May, and they were soon engaged. They married in August at St. Pancras Town Hall. There was a power imbalance throughout the relationship, despite the fondness between the two parties. Picture Leonard as a well-organized, Victorianesque man, securing in his masculinity, but still needing to assert it over his frail, mad wife. He cared for her with the utmost attention during her fits and truly believed that his sending her away to England's various institutions would improve her mental health. Emma Woolf, however, reports that Virginia felt rather differently on the matter. Virginia felt frustrated to be infantilized in this way, with all her decisions made for her. In 1912, she complained, "Leonard made me into a comatose invalid. He made her spend the mornings in bed. He monitored her eating and weight, her moods, and menstrual cycles." This attention to detail speaks simultaneously to great care on Leonard's part, but also a great need to be in control of Virginia. This caused Virginia resentment, and his obsessiveness, tied to her lack of sexual attraction to her husband, strained their relationship despite the affection the two shared. When they were first married, the couple spent their honeymoon first in England before traveling to south of France, Spain, and Italy. Upon returning, they moved to Clifford's Inn and began to divide their time between London and Ascham. Though Virginia wanted to have children, Leonard refused, as he believed Virginia was not mentally strong enough to be a mother and worried that having children might worsen her mental health. Virginia had completed a draft of her first novel called The Voyage Out before her wedding, but made large-scale alterations to the manuscript between December 1912 and March 1913. The work was later accepted by her half-brother Gerald Duckworth's publishing house, but she found the process of reading and correcting the proofs extremely emotionally difficult. This led to one of several breakdowns over the next 2 years. Virginia attempted suicide with an overdose of barbiturates, and she was saved by a surgeon. Virginia's illness led to Duckworth delaying the publication of this book until March of 1915. Then 1922 happened, the year Virginia met the writer and gardener Vita Sackville-West. The glamorous writer was 10 years younger than Virginia and came from an aristocratic family. In 1917, prior to meeting Virginia, Vita caught scandal in high society when she eloped with her lover, Violet Trefesis, to Europe. The pair spent 2 years on and off, running away together and being brought back to England by disgruntled family members. When Vita when Vita met Virginia, she was immediately entranced by Virginia's intellect and eloquence. According to her letters, Vita was quite taken with Virginia, and the two began an intellectual correspondence that eventually became intimate and romantic. They wrote to each other constantly, often in awe and sometimes jealousy of the other's writings. The two women also grew closer through attending a series of dinner parties together in London shortly after they had met. I simply adore Virginia Woolf, and so would you, Vita wrote to her husband after their first meetings. You would fall quite flat before her charmed personality. Comparatively to the relational dynamics with Leonard, Vita and Virginia complemented one another. Neither overbore the other, and they encouraged each other throughout their various struggles with work and romantic endeavors, even after the two had stopped seeing each other as partners. According to another Woolf biography from the Modernist Lab, Virginia felt that Vita was a real woman, that there was some voluptuousness about her. The grapes are ripe and not reflective. No. In brain and insight, she is not as highly organized as I am. But then she is aware of this, and so lavishes on me the maternal protection which, for some reason, is what I have always wished for from everyone. Their relationship was very passionate and very sexual, even though initially their sexual relationship was downplayed and even ignored, says Victoria L. Smith, professor of English at Texas State University. And while the two women were open about their relationship, it was also during a time when British society was more socially conservative. While male homosexuality in the UK was still a criminal offense at the time, there was no equivalent legislation that targeted gay women. Smith says their relationship was hugely significant on Woolf, as Vita made her feel appreciated and adored. Virginia deeply loved Vita, and she was so happy to recognize in Vita that Vita loved and celebrated women. And while Virginia still loved her husband, Leonard, he too saw that Vita had a profound impact on his wife's life and her work, and he did not object to their relationship. After meeting Virginia, Vita decided to publish her books with Hogarth Press, which was the Woolf's own small independent publishing house. Vita's books were commercially and critically the more successful during her and Virginia's lifetimes, although today Virginia's works are more highly regarded. 1924, Vita published her short story Seducers in Ecuador with Hogarth Press to help with the Woolf's mounting debts, and she followed it 6 years later with the novel The Edwardians. This was a financial success. Vita sold all these books, but people just didn't really understand Virginia Woolf's writing, says Smith. But Vita recognized that Woolf was the better writer, writing to her in 1925 that I contrast my illiterate writing with your scholarly one, and I am ashamed. The relationship was clearly a source of inspiration for both women, but 6 years into the relationship, dynamics were evolving. Virginia, the older one, was concerned about becoming dowdy in Vita's eyes, and she feared she was pulling away. Dynamics were changing for whatever reason, but Virginia decided she'd write the most amazing love letter she could to Vita. Not only would it speak of their love and her love for Vita, but this book, the 1928 novel Orlando, would cement Virginia's status as an established writer and her legacy as a master of modernism. Spanning over 300 years, the novel features a protagonist who switches gender in a fantastical exploration of the self. The book was described as the longest and most charming love letter in literature by Vita's son Nigel Nicholson, and others have called it the first trans novel in the English language. In 1927, in one of her diary entries, Virginia wrote that she was writing Orlando half in mock style, very clear and plain, so that people will understand every word. But the balance between truth and fantasy must be careful. It is based on Vita. The work was so personal that Virginia wrote to Vita asking her for permission. Vita replied, "My God, Virginia, if ever I was thrilled and terrified, it is at the prospect of being projected into the shape of Orlando." Orlando begins the novel as a young man who has caught the eye of Queen Elizabeth I. They are everything a man ought to be: brilliant, cocky, wealthy, and well read, a gifted yet self conscious writer, and quite the playboy. A woman scorns them in love, and after cursing women and running off to the Middle East to find themselves for a couple of centuries, Orlando awakens as a woman. Upon their return to England, reveling in their new woman body, Orlando becomes lost in their thoughts, taking time to think on the pros and cons of being a woman. Here it would seem from some ambiguity in her terms that she was censoring both sexes equally, as if she belonged to neither, or the time being she seemed to vacillate. She was man, she was woman. She knew the secrets shared and shared the weaknesses of each. The phrase "she seemed to vacillate," it seems clear. In our 21st century terms, Orlando is gender fluid. Some days they are one, some days they are the other, some days they are neither, some days they are both. When we first see Orlando, Virginia goes on and on about how stunning he is. Happy the mother who bears, happier still the biographer who records the life of such a one. His red cheeks were covered with peach down. The down on his lips was only a little thicker than the down on his cheeks. The lips themselves were short and slightly drawn back over teeth of an exquisite and almond whiteness. And true to form, she goes on for an entire page. She never wastes a chance to tell us how beautiful Orlando is. And Orlando was Vita. Virginia's love letter to Vita is one of the most romantic stories many have read. But Victoria's mental health, modernly referenced as bipolar disease, continued and became worse through World War I and World War II. Virginia's struggle with her manic depressive episodes did not lessen with the weight of the war on her country. She was known to entertain suicidal thoughts. They were part of the reason Leonard had her institutionalized so often. There were a few attempts made when the episodes were at their worst. Then, according to Emma Woolf, Woolf clearly expressed her reasons for committing suicide in her last letter to her husband Leonard. "I feel certain that I am going mad again. I feel we can't go through another of those terrible times. And I can't recover this time. I begin to hear voices and I can't concentrate." On March 18th, she may have attempted to drown herself. Over a week later, on March 28th, Virginia wrote the third of her suicide letters and walked the half mile to the river house, filled her pockets with stones, and walked into the water. For Virginia, it was her only escape from the world that she felt constrained and weighed her down. Virginia Woolf is not an unproblematic figure. She endured several difficult sorts of struggles throughout her life, but many of us today may be able to relate to them. Her feminist works and queer relationships allow modern readers of her stories to draw parallels between themselves and a woman who made it farther in life than many of her family and friends believed she would. She is a figure who, at the least, history must recognize as queer, even if that queerness is imperfect. Thank you for joining me today to learn about English author Virginia Woolf, her life, and her lesbian relationship with Vita Sackville-West. I encourage you, when interacting with others in our community who struggle with relationships and mental health issues, despite their race, accent, religion, sexuality, gender, or any other attribute, it's more important to be kind than to be right. I hope that you can find other areas in your world that remind you to avoid discrimination and biases towards others. If you'd like to support the Pride Chronicles, please share this podcast with your friends. Also, full episode notes can be found at thepridechronicles.com, and links to the articles that I use for this episode are noted in the comments. Until next time, see you later.